Good afternoon, everyone. Um, so now this week it's time for us to switch gears. I've done the first half of the French colonies from Algeria up to Martinique. The majority of the material turned out to be quite inexpensive. The lots were all fairly large, a lot of stamps, so it became apparent to me that there was really no way that I was going to be able to cover the entire um, colonial empire in 1 week. So I've decided to switch gears and start the Canada for this week, a little early. And the one area I want to do a deep dive on, which I haven't done in a while now, are the small queens. So those, for the collectors new to Canada, are sort of the quintessential Queen Victorian stamps that were issued between 1870 and 1897. So before the Jubilee issue appears, and the old Queen design replaces the younger Queen. Now, different catalogs have treated this issue differently, and it's a source of contention for most collectors who have a great deal of difficulty, in my experience, classifying the different printings. In my opinion, a large part of the difficulty with that results from the way Unitrade treats this issue, as opposed to, say, Stanley Gibbons, which I think does a better job of portraying the issue the way it actually appeared. But neither catalog, in my opinion, really does it full justice. The difficulty with the large and the small queens is that in reality, they overlap. Okay, they're not discrete issues where you just have large queens at ends and then it's small queens and ends. Some values of the small queens came out at different times toward the later part of the issue. Other issues of the large queens were in use throughout the entire small queen period, and so on. So also, the distinction Montreal versus Ottawa is a little bit oversimplified. Okay, because in reality, the very first printings of the small queen stamps were made in Ottawa. And so, the correct, in my opinion, distinction should be between first Ottawa printings, which were made between 1870 and about 1872. Okay, and first Ottawas cover only the 1 cent, the 2 cent, and the 3 cent, and some printings of the 6 cent. Those are the only values of the set that were available when they were first issued. Okay, so when they came out between 1870 and 72, the other values were all large queens. So the 12.5 cent large queen, the 15 cent, those were still in use. So first Ottawas are the very first printings. Then you get the Montreal period proper. And I like to distinguish between, I like to break the Montreal period up into 3 periods, which I'll identify separately. So the first period, the early Montreals, which I think go from about 1873 to 1875 or so, cover the 1 cent, the 2 cent, the 3 cent. Still, there are no other values at that time. The perf on those stamps generally is always 12 or 11.9 by 12. And there's a variety of different papers which I'll get into. Then you get the mid period of the Montreal period, which is from about 1875 until 1880. And in the mid period, you get the appearance of the perf 11.5 by 12 and the 11.75 by 12. Now, Unitrade doesn't even mention 11.75 by 12, but it's basically the same group of printings as 11.5. And it has the same scarcity as the perf 11.5 by 12s. And this period is when the 5 cent appears and the 5 cent large queen appears. So one of the reasons the 5 cent large queen is so expensive is because it was very short-lived. It came out in 1875, and in less than a year it was replaced in 1876 by the 5 cent small queen. In the mid-period, we also have the appearance of the 10 cent, which I think appears in 1877, if I'm not mistaken. So the mid-period is notable for the perforations. It's also the period in which the plate dots at the lower left corners of most subjects on the plate appears. New plates are made in 1880. And so that's the reason I like to distinguish between the mid-period and the late period. So the late Montreal period begins in 1880 and it runs up until 1887, when there was a fire that destroyed the Montreal printing works, and so printing was moved to the Montreal Gazette. And so there's a very brief period from 1887 until 1889 when the printing was carried out at the Montreal Gazette. Some collectors think of this as the very beginning of the Second Ottawa period. But really, I mean, it's its own distinct period. It's the transition from Montreal to Ottawa. Or I should say Montreal to Second Ottawa, because of course we had the First Ottawa period at the very beginning of the issue. So after the Montreal Gazette period in 1889, we get the Second Ottawa period. And again, I like to split this up because there are a couple of key dates that occur in that period that distinguish different printings within that period. So one of the key dates is the introduction of the new plates in I think it's 1891 or 93. I'm not sure the exact date, but it's one of those two dates. There are new plates introduced. So if you look at the early Second Ottawa printings, they're quite worn. The finer details of the design are not as visible, and then you get these really crisp stamps that have full design detail visible. And again, I'll get into this in some more detail later on in subsequent videos, but they look just far too crisp, almost as if they were early Montreals, but they're printed on paper that's clearly not Montreal paper. And so those are the later or the mid-period Second Ottawa printings, which are on the later papers. Then in 1895, there is the introduction of a high-quality calendared wove paper. And actually, I think it may even, I think it came out in 1895, I'm pretty sure, from my studies of the 3 cent. So I split the Second Ottawa period up into early Second Ottawa, which is 1889 until 91-93 when the new plates were introduced. The mid-Second Ottawa period from 1891-93 until the introduction of the high-quality paper. So this is the period where you see what most collectors think of as the poor quality newsprint that Second Ottawa printings are found on. The poor quality paper falls into that period. Most of the very first Ottawa printings in 1889 to 91, they're on a poorer quality paper than the Montreal, but it's not the newsprint. And it can be difficult for a novice collector to correctly identify those early transitional printings because they don't possess the poor quality paper characteristics of the mid printings. Then in 1895 we get the late period, and the late period contains both the poor quality paper and a new paper, a highly calendared, better quality, soft wove paper that's quite white. And again, it tends to make the stamp impressions look very crisp, very clean. You see it quite a lot on the 3-cent and on the widow's weeds. So in this period, so the 8-cent gray appears in 1893, so it falls into the mid period of the second Ottawa printings. The 10-cent occurs all throughout the late Montreal, the late Montreals, all the way up through the whole second Ottawa period. The widow's weeds are introduced in 1893, so those fall into the mid and late second Ottawa periods. During this time, all throughout the small queens, the 15-cent large queen is in use all the way through, and actually its printings and its paper characteristics will be similar to the small queen stamps. The half-cent black is issued in 1882. So it first appears in what I would call the late Montreal period and persists all the way up through the entire second Ottawa period. And the half-cent large queen is in use all through the early part of the issue up until it's replaced by the half-cent small queen. So that sort of gives you an idea of which large queens dovetail this issue. So that's an overview of in my opinion, what the different periods are. Now, in Unitrade, they only distinguish between Montreal and Ottawa. And collectors, as I say, have a hard time distinguishing these two printings, and part of the reason for this is because, at least in my opinion, they've oversimplified the distinction. And if you break the periods up the way I have into early, mid, late periods for each of Montreal and second Ottawa, it becomes, and you start looking at the characteristics of the stamps for each of those 6 periods, it becomes easier to distinguish them. There are a number of tests that collectors have employed over the years to distinguish Montreal from Ottawa. And so the first question collectors might have is, well, why bother? Why is it so important to distinguish between Montreal and Ottawa? And the major reason has to do with scarcity and value. So in Unitrade, the Ottawa printings are cataloged quite low, especially for used, with, the 3-cent, 1-cent, 2-cent values cataloging as little as 50 cents or 35 cents a piece in used condition. And in actuality, in reality, you can buy very large unsorted lots of mostly Ottawa. I mean, they don't even distinguish between Montreal and Ottawa for much cheaper than that. But buried within there are pockets of scarce printings that are not specifically identified by Unitrade. And again, this is another reason why I make these distinctions. but by and large, Montreal printings catalog anywhere from 2 to 10 times as much as Ottawa printings do, even in used conditions. So being able to tell one apart from the other becomes quite important. Now, what I'm going to do in the remainder of this video is I'm going to give you an overview of what the tests are. I'm not going to demonstrate them on the specific stamps. I'll do that in later videos, because what I'm going to be doing with the auction is I'm probably going to cover 1 or 2 values at a time, because to do this in depth and to present different varieties and reentries and shades and perfs is going to take a lot of time. And I want to do it proper justice, so I'm going to limit my coverage probably to one of the low values and a couple of the higher values each week. And this will probably be a 2 or 3 week effort, I think. Maybe less if I'm very quick in identifying, but so what I was thinking I will do is, as I'm identifying and going through each value, I'll do a separate video where I look at the specific stamp, and I'll give you specific pointers on how to identify the printings for each of these stamps. But it helps to start by looking at the issue as a whole, which I'll do now. So there are a number of tests, as I said, that collectors typically use to try to distinguish Montreal printings from Ottawa printings, but the difficulty with all of them is that there are exceptions to all the rules. And so it becomes objectively difficult for collectors to apply the tests and to know with certainty whether the stamp they have is a Montreal printing or an Ottawa printing. And when I say Ottawa, I mean second Ottawa. So, and this is particularly the case on the 1 cent and the 2 cent. The 3 cents a little bit easier because the shade is so different on the Ottawas. But on Montreal, or I should say on the 1 cent yellow and 2 cent green, it's very, very difficult for most collectors. The half cent is another one that presents some difficulty. The other values, the 10 I often see misidentified on Hip Stamp and on eBay all the time. I see, clear Montreals identified as Ottawas, but most often what I see are Ottawa printings identified as Montreal. So I'll go through the tests now. So one of the first tests that collectors use is they look for a position dot in the lower left corner of the design. So the early plates that were used in Montreal up until 1880, the sideographers typically on all subjects in the plate, except for those in the first column, so positions 1 to 91 in the first column of the sheet, had a small dot in the lower left corner of the design. And if you can spot that dot, then you know for sure that you have a Montreal printing. And further, you know that it's a pre-1880 printing, or up to 1880. So it's useful in that respect. The problem with using this test and relying on it is that the centering on the small queen's issue is so poor generally that more often than not the perforations have punched out the hole, or have punched out the dot, I should say. And there are a lot of stamps on which you can't see any position dots that are clear Montreal printings. It's much more than 10%, I can tell you that. So it's a bit of a hit or miss test. It's useful if you find the dot, but not so useful if you don't. So another test that's often used is cancellations. The general rule of thumb is that if there's a CDS cancel on the stamp, it's a second Ottawa printing, and that if it has a cork cancel or a non-CDS cancel, it's a Montreal. Now this is a very, very weak, flimsy test because there are many, many exceptions to this rule. There are quite a few Montreal or printings that had CDS cancels and split ring CDSs in the 1870s. You don't see them very often. They are scarcer, to be sure, but they do exist. And the presence of a CDS by itself does not automatically rule it out as a Montreal printing. However, it is true that the vast majority of CDS canceled stamps that you will come across will be second Ottawas. Certainly if they have dates in the 1890s, they for sure are second Ottawas. It is possible that you can have, from small post offices, some Montreal printings that were used very, very late. And that's a factor that one has to consider, because when the post offices order new stock and when they get new sheets in, quite often those are placed on top of the stack in the postal drawer of whatever was there. And so if the supplies aren't completely exhausted before the next batch arrives, those early printings will be at the bottom of the stack. And so it's entirely possible that you can have a situation where an old printing keeps getting new printings placed on top of it and doesn't actually wind up getting sold or used for many, many years. Now that's not going to happen in a place like Toronto or in any major city like Vancouver or Montreal, but it could happen at some of the small village post offices. And so you can only really use cancels as a guide. Also, you can find second Ottawas that have cork cancels. Corks were used up until the 1890s. You can find some of the later Queen Victoria with corks, although by then they are quite scarce. And again, generally speaking, if you have a cork cancel, chances are very good that it predates the 1897 period. But it's not, again, it's just a guide. So cancels is probably the least useful of the tests that are often employed, but it's not entirely useless. It will help you to separate your stamps into rough categories. The third test is the actual value itself. So there are some stamps in the set that are only second Ottawa. They only come that way because of when they were issued, and those are the 8-cent black, violet black, or gray. That stamp was issued in 1893 when the combined 5-cent UPU rate and 3-cent registered rate, I should say the 3-cent UPU rate and 5-cent registration rate were introduced for a combined total of 8 cents. That stamp was issued specifically to pay those combination rates. And so it only exists second Ottawa. So that's an easy test there. The widow's weeds are only second Ottawa, so those are the 20-cent vermilion and 50-cent blue. But every other value occurs both ways. So that's a very limited test. Not really a test, but more of a categorization when you're sorting a large group. Okay, a fourth test is shade. So looking at colors. Shades, if you're very experienced, are extremely useful. But again, they require some experience to be able to identify and to become comfortable with them. So the easiest ones are, I find, on the 5-cent, 6-cent, and 10-cent. On the half-cent, 1-cent, 2-cent, 3-cent, they're much they're more difficult. Although the distinction between Montreal and Ottawa and the 3 cent is pretty easy. So we'll just take each value at a time here. So on the half cent, the gray blacks are usually Montreal. Okay, the blacks can be either Montreal or second Ottawa, but typically the gray-black shades are earlier and are slightly better. On the 1 cent, the second Ottawa shades typically are yellow, deep yellow, bright yellow, and lemon yellow. There can be some orange yellow as well, but the sort of mustard yellows, acidic lemon yellow, and sort of pale yellows, dull yellows, those tend to be Montreal. The other shades, the more bright yellow it has in it, the more likely it is to be a second Ottawa printing. So bright yellow to a sort of orangey yellow, but not orange, still a clear yellow. Whereas a greenish yellow, dull yellow, mustardy yellow, dirty yellow, those tend to be Montreal. Because the original printings of the 1 cent are actually deep red orange. So the very first Ottawa printings are deep red orange. Then you get orange in the very first Montreals, and orange gives way to dull yellow. The 2 cent is, most commonly what you see in the very earliest periods are a grass green, a deep grass green shade, which becomes a pure green. And then it progresses through green into a blue green, and finally kind of a sea green. And then it goes back to being grass green. So the early Montreals are grass green, but then so are the late second Ottawas. So grass green by itself is not that useful for identifying the printings, and blue-green isn't either, because blue-green can be either Montreal or second Ottawa. But if you come across a sea green, that almost always is a second Ottawa shade. Typically, the closer, in order to sort 2 cent small queens, you're going to need to look at paper, which is the next test I'll discuss. On the 3 cent, the shades here are quite helpful. Any Rose Carmins or Deep Rose Carmins or Montreal Gazette printings. The main difference between Montreal and Ottawa is Montreals are going to be either copper red, Indian red, orange red, or dull red, but not vermilion. All of the second Ottawa printings of the 3 cent are in a shade of vermilion. Now, it can be orange vermilion, it can be deep vermilion, it can be dull vermilion, but it's definitely vermilion and not orange. And the distinction between vermilion and orange is that vermilion is a color that has more red in it than orange. Okay, it's not red. It definitely tends more to orange than it does to red, but it has more red in it than orange. And there's a clear, it's hard to explain beyond that, but any stamp that has a vermilion hue to it is a second Ottawa printing. It's not a Montreal. That being said, there are many, many shades of the orange-red and orange in the Montreal period, and listing them all is a huge task. The 3 cent is probably the most complicated value in the set, and the one that benefits the most from dividing the periods up into early, mid, and late sub-periods the way that I have at the beginning of the video. The 5 cent, okay, the 5 cent is one of the easiest values in my opinion to sort. It's described in the catalog as being a slate green or a gray. Now, there are several different gray shades in the second Ottawa period, but none of them have any green. So the key distinction between Montreal and Ottawa on the 5 cent is whether or not the gray contains any green hue. If it contains green, it's Montreal. If it doesn't contain green, and it's either a brownish gray or a pure gray or a pearl gray or some such, it's a second Ottawa printing. The 8 cent, as I said, all the shades there are second Ottawa, so there's really nothing to look at there. The 10 cent, okay, the 10 cent, the basic shades are magenta, dull rose lilac, or various versions of rose lilac, brown red, or Venetian red, pinks, and what they call dull roses, but really they're kind of a deep rose red. So the pinks, the dull roses, and the brown reds are all second Ottawa. The rose lilacs and magentas are Montreal. And if you think of it in terms of warm versus cold shades, all the warm colors of the 10 cent are second Ottawa. All the cold colors are Montreal. And that sort of wraps up the color test in a nutshell. Perf is another one that often is employed. So perfs, the catalog quotes just 12 and 11.5 by 12, but in reality, the perforations on the small queens are way more complicated than that. So the very first printings, the very first Ottawas, typically are perf 11.9, 12, or compounds of 11.9 by 12. Okay, then the very earliest Montreals are perf 12, exactly. The mid-period, you see the introduction of 11.5 by 12, 11.6 by 12, and 11.75 by 12. And there's a rare perf on the 6 cent where it's the other way around, 12 by 11.5. There's also one exception, the perf 12.5 by 12.5 on the 3 cent, which is actually a first Ottawa printing in copper red or Indian red. But that's the only instance of that perf on the set. Okay, then in the mid to late Montreal period, you start seeing perf 12.1, 12.2, and 12.25, and compounds thereof. And those are still Montreal, and they can also be second Ottawa. So it's not really all that helpful to separate by perf unless you're identifying 12.25 by 12.25 tends to be Montreal Gazette. And 11.5 by 12, 11.6, or 11.75 are mid-period Montreal. But other than that, it's not really all that useful for pinning down the dates, although I will say that perf 12 exactly tends to be a little bit rarer and hard in the second Ottawa period. I mean, it does exist, but it's not as common as it is in the Montreal period. Most second Ottawas will actually be slightly different from 12, usually 12.1 or 12.2 on at least one side. But so then this brings us to the last test, which in my opinion is the only test that you can employ that will tell with certainty whether or not you have a Montreal or an Ottawa printing, and that is the paper. So there's many, many different kinds of paper in each period. And so, I mean, the general characteristics of thickness, quality, whether the mesh is horizontal or vertical, whether you can see clear mesh or not, those are somewhat helpful. But none of those tests are definitive because each of the 6 periods has papers that display those characteristics. And so it's not all that helpful to describe them that way in trying to narrow down the printings. But what is helpful is looking at the finish of the paper under magnification on the printing side to see if it's a finished paper or whether it's rough and unfinished and has loose fibers. So the paper of the second Ottawa period is always rough and unfinished. If you look at it under a magnifying glass, you're going to see loose fibers, you're going to see pores, you're going to see pits. It will not appear smooth. Whereas the Montreal paper is always smooth. It may have a few little indents or depressions, but what you will not see on Montreal paper is loose fibers or, very large areas of unevenness or loose and fibers that are coming apart. You'll see instead a very burnished, finished, high quality paper. And that, to me, in my opinion, having dealt with these issues for the better part of 40 years, is the most reliable test for separating those two out. Look at your stamp under a magnifying glass, high-powered magnification, at least 10 times. Look at the margins, okay, at the printed side, and see if the paper is smooth and finished looking, or is it rough with clear, loose fibers. So that concludes my overview video on the small queens. Please stay tuned for my individual videos where I'll go through each value as I sort them, and I'll show you how to apply the tests in each case and how to split your printings up into the 6 periods that I've identified. Thanks for watching. Bye.